I wanted to tell the story of how we met. I had seen you speak a couple of times, and I, had read your books. And the first time was at Diana Abu Jaber's Easter party.
Was that when I brought the brown eggs from my chickens?
I don't remember that. But I remember we spoke. We talked for like a half hour, one-on-one. We had a long conversation. And then I saw you again like 3 weeks later at another party, at Jeff and Jim's garden party, which is the big, fantastic party they have. They used to have it every summer, and it's
with
like a
Pink
wedding.
Martini.
Yeah,
right.
Pink Martini was playing, and lots of people. And I saw you, and I went right over, uber confident that, of course, I am so memorable that you would take one look at me and know who I was. And I walked over. You were actually conversing with someone. I walked right over, and I said, "Hi, Chuck." And you looked at me, and you said, "I'm sorry, have we met?" And I said, "Yeah, at Diana's party." And you said, "Diana?" And I reminded you, and you were like, oh, right. I'm so sorry, of course. And then a few weeks after that, I was in London doing a reading of a book that I had coming out there, an anthology, at the Charing Cross Borders. And I saw that there were flyers that you were going to be there the next night. And so I did my reading, and there were 4 people there, including my editor and a friend she had brought. And so I thought, well, we should come. I was there with my husband. We should come tomorrow, to support Chuck, because he's a hometown writer, and we should be there. And, I wouldn't want there to be just 4 people in his audience. So even though I was afraid you would think at that point that I was stalking you, I decided, to go. And so we took the tube in, and we showed up at the Charing Cross Borders. And it was a zoo. There were like 5,000 people there. We couldn't even see you. There were so many people there who'd come. It's like you were a rock star. And afterwards, I decided I was going to go up and say hi to you, again, in the hopes that you might remember me. No, but we showed up at the reading, and we sort of elbowed our way past the 1,000 people waiting to get their book signed after the reading, and I said right away, "I'm Chelsea from Portland. We met at Diana's party, and then again at Jeff and Jim's party."
And I said, "May I see some identification?"
No, you said, and maybe you were faking. "Oh, Chelsea, it's so nice to see you again."
Yeah, I have a string in my side. I pull that string, and it basically says the same thing.
Right.
How have you been? May I make this book out to you?
Right. Yeah, and that was the third time we met. And then the fourth time we met at, I believe it was Diana Abu Jaber's Labor Day party.
With the dogs?
With the dogs.
Okay.
And from then on, we were friends. But we ended up in a writing group together. And why don't you talk a little bit about the writing group?
I was in a dying writing group that was rapidly losing people.
Why do you think that is, Chuck?
My useful critiques, no doubt. And so I thought, Chelsea would be a great addition because Chelsea is a professional, and she produces, and she's just, she's a craftsman. And so I thought you'd be a perfect addition because there are some people who are dilettantes, and there are some people who are very seriously into writing, that they will write and they will make a living at writing. So I kind of campaigned to bring you in. It's been a really perfect compliment. And you are just masterful at acknowledging what works in people's writing and what could work better.
Thank you.
So you're just very, very good at not laughing.
Until later. I remember the first workshop that I came to. And this workshop, we read our work aloud. And I had never been a part of a workshop where you actually were required to read your work aloud to strangers at the time. I knew Chuck, and I knew no one else in the group. And the work I had was Heartsick. I was maybe 150 pages into it at that point, into the first draft of Heartsick. And I brought the first chapter of that book in to read, and it was really scary because it's such it was something I had been working on while still meeting with my girl writer group, and I had been too embarrassed to read it to them because it was so kind of pulp, and their work was so literary and so high-minded that I just was too self-conscious. I couldn't do it. And then I decided with the new writing group I was just going to bring it in. It's what I needed. I needed feedback on this work because it's what I was working on. And I brought in that first chapter, and I was nauseous, like literally nauseated. And I read that first chapter out loud, and everybody liked it. There were definitely, there were comments. There were edits, constructive criticism, but everybody was so encouraging. And it was the first time that I had a sense that I could finish this and that maybe I could publish it. It was great. It was so affirming. And I've said this to the writing group so many times, but there is no way that I ever would have finished the book, I think. And there certainly is no way I ever would have sold it if it hadn't been for the feedback I got. When the first draft of Heartsick, the first earlier draft of Heartsick, it was really difficult for me to unpack some of the violent imagery. And I had brought in a chapter where a dead girl was found on the beach, and I had described her as a dead naked girl on the beach. And that was it. It was just the character stood around the dead naked girl on the beach. And I brought that in, and I remember I read it out loud, and I finished it, and I looked up, and you were just shaking your head. You said no. I want to know what that dead girl on the beach looks like. I want to know what she smells like. And
the sound of the flies.
Yeah.
And I want to know how that's going to change the taste of everything I eat for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
I want to know every physical aspect of that dead girl on the beach. I mean, you've really got to slowly unpack those moments. You've got to slowly reveal the full horror of what you're showing.
Yeah, and I went home and I sat down at my desk and I got out all the forensic pathology books that you had lent me. And I forced myself to really think about that and really describe it and go into it. And, it was difficult. It was sort of difficult emotionally. But I loved the way that it came together. And I think that it was so important to the book to feel, what these characters saw, because, that's part of the emotional narrative. It has to be horrifying, and it's not horrifying if it's just a dead girl on the beach. You have to be able to paint a picture so that it's cinematic. Let's talk a little bit more about violence, because I think I told you when I was in London, I was interviewed, and this guy asked me for the first time, he asked me to defend how violent Heartsick was. And was sort of confrontational about it. And it so blindsided me. I was so surprised that it would even be an issue. It's a violent book, but there are a lot of violent books and a lot of violent everything. But then again, I got asked in an interview last week specifically how I would respond to people criticizing me as a woman writing violence, which I thought was even more ludicrous, the idea that it was somehow more offensive to have a woman writing violence than a man. And as someone who also has written some violent scenes, what do you think about that?
I think one of the reasons why we have maybe more violence in the world is because it tends to be portrayed in such a clean way in mass media, that the cowboy gets shot once in the heart and falls down completely dead, clutching a bloodless bullet hole. When in fact, if you shoot someone, it takes them 20 minutes to several hours to die, and they die in the worst possible pain, and they die during a very long process. And so I think if you're going to depict violence, you have a social responsibility to unpack that violence in an incredibly realistic, visceral way. Because otherwise you're just making the problem of violence worse by making people think that death is an easy, painless thing. And I think that books are really the only form of mass media right now that have the freedom to depict things like that, depict those aspects of human experience. They have an intimate, consensual nature of consumption with the reader who makes that ongoing, educated effort to consume the story. And since books are the only storytelling form that can depict those stories, books have a responsibility to depict those stories. So It's the one strength left to books right now.
Do you have any other questions for me?
Years ago, this is going to my personal experience, I had written a spectacularly bad first novel, and I had set it in Portland, and one of the few agents that bothered to write me back after I submitted this manuscript said, "Why is this set in Portland, Oregon? How is that going to make it any more saleable? Why not set this in New York?"
Ouch.
And yet with Heartsick, you set it in Portland, and you make it work. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, part of it was laziness because I live in Portland and it seemed easier than setting it in Chicago and having to imagine what that might be like and, God forbid, actually research it. And I also thought it would add a regional interest. I mean, so many thrillers are set in L.A. specifically and also in New York that I thought it would be interesting to have some of these archetypes occur in a different setting, that it would make it a little bit different. And I think the Pacific Northwest is kind of scary. We have a lot of serial killers here, I mean, I grew up in Bellingham, and, we had the Green River Killer and Ted Bundy, and the Hillside Stranglers were up there for a while. And, I mean, it seemed like there were serial killers everywhere. And it rains so much here. It's spooky. There's just these huge old trees, and there's just this sense of nature in a way that I think is a little ominous. Maybe I need to hike more. But, I mean, I love that. I mean, I love that feeling of seeing these mountains. But, you look up at the mountain and it's so beautiful, and yet then the next week there's a story about how 3 more hikers have disappeared and they find their bodies when the glacier melts. So there's just this association. You look at the woods and it's beautiful, but there are 8 dead Boy Scouts out there and they're going to dig their femurs up, in the spring. And that tension, I think, is really interesting. And I think Portland, I was worried that people wouldn't buy the fact that that there would be this sort of activity, the serial killer task force and all of that in Portland, Oregon. And I hope that people do. I hope that it's convincing enough. But I think there have been enough serial killers out here that people will go along for the ride, I hope.
A couple of years ago, I was reading an FBI profile of the Northwest, and they referred to the triangle formed between Vancouver, British Columbia, Portland, Oregon, and Spokane, Washington as the killing fields. They said because people in the Northwest are, number one, really friendly and really gullible. And if you pretend to have a broken leg, they'll get in your car and put on the handcuffs themselves.
Yeah.
And number two, metropolitan areas tend to be very, very close to wilderness areas. You don't have to drive very, very far with that thing duct taped in your trunk.
Yeah.
And number three, it's temperate enough with a constant moisture and then the heat and occasional snows that things rot really very quickly and that a body is reduced to a skeleton in a matter of days. So those 3 things make the Northwest very appealing.
I have the fourth to seasonal affective disorder.
There you go.
I think that's the root of most of it. We're all this far away from snapping or joining a grunge band.
We're taking Vicodin.
We're taking Vicodin, self-medicating. I might have done a little research.
Yeah, you can tax deduct that.
Can I? Yeah, okay, I'll tell the IRS you said it was okay. All right.
All right.